Why don't we begin Sociology 1 once again and see what's on the agenda and what's on the docket. So first of all, a couple of just sort of quasi-business items. As you know, you took the midterm last week, and that's generated a lot of commotion among us, and particularly the TAs who are busy at work, enjoying the opportunity to read them. And that will go on for probably another week from now. So roughly speaking, it certainly will be, I think, within 2 weeks, you will have the blue books back and get to see what your grade is, and you get to see what we think you've managed to pick up over these early weeks of the semester. So that's always exciting. The Blue Book return date. I wanted to mention a few things about the readings. A number of you I know have asked about this. The book by Mitchell Dunier, Sidewalk, has not come up very much in lecture. It did at the beginning, and it's going to come up again and again starting next week. But what I wanted you to do was, of course, have the opportunity to read it on a gradual...
Sergeant, come on, quick, we got a 10:13.
Go on, get a move on.
Whoa, I got...
Don't let me catch none of these around here when I get back.
It started on its own. Whoa. We have a haunted video system. So what I was saying was that we're going to talk more about the Dunier book as the semester goes on, but I didn't want it to appear as a reading in any one given week because it's the most lengthy thing that, that's all right. They're going to be quizzed on that. Hey, you, did you get it? That's going to be an important part of the final exam. So we've got the Hey You issue cleared up, and we've got the, I've told you about the Dunier, and it's going to start figuring in a significant way starting next week. And also the Gambetta reading, which is the Diego Gambetta, is also going to start happening at a later point in the course. So it will come up, but then it will come up in a more significant way later on. So if it doesn't seem like we're giving it the attention it deserves, that's because it's going to be discussed later on as well. Now, what we're getting all techno ready for you here is that little scene from West Side Story, and I thought I'd use it as your reward for coming back after the midterm exam. And next time we pull it off, we're going to just show it because it's been too exciting. But you can read this as a kind of, I wanted to show it while we were talking about deviance. So it's a little out of kilter now, but that's all right because your minds are wild and rugged, and you can move back into 2 weeks ago, I guess that is now, the readings of that time. So, and I remember brought it up, Officer Krumke, and I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't remember how to spell it. I couldn't remember the lyrics. Well, now you're going to see it, you're going to hear it, all on your own. So without further ado, Maestro. It's theories of deviance. That's the way to think about this. It's different theories of deviance in musical form.
Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing upkeep that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly Moses, naturally we're punks. Gee, Officer Krupke, we're very upset. We never had the love that every child ought to get. We ain't no delinquents, we're misunderstood. Deep down inside us there is good. There is good, there is good, there is good, there is untapped good. Like inside, the worst of us is good.
That's a touching good story.
Let me tell it to the world.
Just tell it to the judge.
Dear kindly judge your honor, my parents treat me rough with all their marijuana. They won't give me a puff. They didn't want to have me, but somehow I was had. Leaping lizards, that's why I'm so bad.
Right, Officer Krupke, you're real square. This boy don't need a judge, he needs an analyst's care. It's just his neurosis that ought to be quiet. He's psychologically disturbed.
I'm disturbed.
We're disturbed, we're the most disturbed, like we're psychologically disturbed.
Hey! In the opinion of this court, this child is depraved on account he ain't had a normal home.
Hey, I'm depraved on account I'm deprived.
So take him to a head shrinker. You!
Who, me?
Oops.
My daddy beats my mommy clobbers me. My grandpa is a commie, my grandma pushes tea. My sister wears a mustache, my brother wears a dress. Goodness gracious, that's why I'm a mess.
Yes, Officer Krupke, he shouldn't be here. This boy don't need a couch, he needs a useful career. Society's played him a terrible trick. And sociologically, he's sick.
I am sick.
We are sick, we are sick, we are sick, 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 like we're sociologically sick.
In my opinion, this child does not need to have his head shrunk at all. Juvenile delinquency is purely a social disease. Hey, I got a social disease.
One of the things that we might note about this is that that gang life in New York in this rendition is a replay of Romeo and Juliet. So the troubles in the slums, where you just heard a whole series of versions of the troubles in the slums, the social disease, the psychologically disturbed, all of these are possibilities. But then there's another possibility, which is the Romeo and Juliet possibility, which is that there is a conflict between two families, the Puerto Ricans and the Italians on the Upper West Side of New York, or the Capulets and the Montagues in Shakespeare. And the manifestation of that conflict between the two groups, which is, shows their irrationality and the capacities for creating great troubles, including violence. All it hinges on and becomes manifest in the ruin of the perfect love, the love of Romeo and Juliet, the romance, the romantic love of those two people. So that's one perspective then on gangs, on violence, and its manifestation and what's at stake and how it operates and what's the basis of it. And one way to critique Romeo and Juliet and the West Side Story, and I hate doing that because I think Romeo and Juliet is just terrific, and I also think West Side Story is, as far as I'm concerned, the best musical by far that's ever been produced. So far be it from me, but that's my business here. And a criticism would be is that they have located conflict within the sort of, at the individualistic level of why can't people, as Rodney King, whose name may not be known to you, a person who was beaten by the police in Los Angeles some years ago, as Rodney King said, why can't we all get along? A kind of mystery which is there because there's no reason for conflict. Now, is there? It's really all quite irrational, and it springs from the kind of irrationalities of human beings. And this perspective is one that the mass media portrays quite a lot in drama and in musicals. There are other explanations. And so although this implied they had a sociological explanation for what's going on, for most sociologists, I think we would say they don't have a very sociological explanation for what's going on because we don't have racism, we don't have the consequences of social class, we don't have police harassment, You saw police harassment, but it's musically done, as opposed to done with violence. We don't have systems of control in the courts, initiated by the police, the schools. All of that is really absent. So we're missing the institutional, the organizational, the macro structures that sociologists would indeed look to explain what's going on among, say, youth gangs. And that's not what's here. So although I thought of showing this clip when we were talking about deviance, it now strikes me that it really is also a way to help talk about and think about mass media and how the mass media operate in society and what indeed is going on. What scholars and those who study the media have observed, it's a kind of a starting point, is that what we know about the world is in fact mediated. There's that word, media, but in the form of an event, an activity, a phenomenon, and that is the media mediate. And that is quite critical, and we shouldn't just take that for granted. So again, the contrast would be, say, in a Weberian, Max Weber, remember him, a tradition society run on the basis of tradition, that people just get up in the morning and do whatever they're going to do based on the fact that everyone else did it the same way. Those are also, in the Weber orientation, small-scale societies. Technologies are very limited, and people, what is in their minds is heavily based on first-hand experience. That is, they know the village, they've been there, they've seen them. An enormous amount of what is in their mind of how the world works is not mediated through indirect portrayals of what the world is. Rather, they receive it quite directly through the observations they can make firsthand. But what happens with scale, when societies become very large and individuals are integrated into large cities, nation states, and so forth and so on, and the technology changes, the development of mass media. The first newspapers were the penny press, the development of the Gutenberg press, which made the circulation of documents on a wide scale possible. Then what happens is that you're not limited by what you see, and you're also not limited by legends and religion. Religion, of course, is a mechanism by which people's heads are filled with events and phenomena of which they have no direct experience. But they're really nobody's direct experience. They live on through legend and myth and religious doctrine, but they don't impinge directly on anyone's experience. They're hearsay through generations and generations of being repeated. But when the mass media come into being, then what is in our heads is mediated, and to a degree that we are not aware, and indeed we can't be aware. So unlike you have no computer program in your head, like in Microsoft Word, where you can look up the file and see when it was put in there, and maybe even what its names were as it has evolved. It's what is in your mind is just, it's heavily just there. We lose track of where we got the information that's in our heads, not and when. It's just there, which is why psychologists like Freudians have so much interesting things to say about your mother's breast and what happened when you were weaned, and did you get weaned or didn't you get weaned? You don't know anything about any of that stuff. But they would say that it's somehow still in you, even though you're not aware of the fact that it came then during your, say, infancy. Well, in the same way, our brain, our minds are filled with those symbolic stories, symbols just in the sense of symbolic interaction. No big deal symbols, just words, and which words then which accumulate can make stories, can make memories, which we are then working with, sometimes consciously, sometimes less consciously, that through which we then through which we then see the world. And I said a minute ago, we don't know where this stuff came from. We don't even know the genre of where it came from. So much that's in our minds, we don't know if we read it in the paper, if we saw it on television, or if a friend told us, or one of our parents or lovers or someone else. We don't know where it came from after a while. It just becomes a kind of grand pea soup, but a critical pea soup because it's the way in which we see the world. One of the things that we really come to not be able to distinguish is the difference between media that have come to us in the form of entertainment and media which have come to us in the form of news. Now, the distinction is it's important, some would say. So those, for example, who write about democracy, political scientists, social philosophers, they believe, some of them at least, and have gone to great lengths to present the idea that in a democracy, it is critical that people be informed. If after all, we all run our city together, we all run our state together, we run our nation together, then what we think about the world, what is the information in our heads, what are the movies in our head about how the world works, that becomes critical because it determines how we vote, it determines whether we sign petitions, and whether we join social movements, whether we protest, whether we don't. All of these things happen because of the pictures that are in our heads. And there's a famous sociological saying by a famous sociologist. We only deal in famous ones here in this social one. W.I. Thomas. There we go. And he said things. He long dead, so writing and talking in a sexist time. Things which men perceive as real are real in their consequence. So the running around the world trying to tell people and show people that what's in their head is wrong has only limited capacity, because if they believe it, it will have consequences that will be real. Fantasies maybe don't come true, but fantasies make something come true, even if the fantasy was based on something that was not true. So W.I. Thomas said, things which men perceive as real are real in their consequences. So that ups the stakes for how the pictures get in our heads and how those pictures then are transferred to result in some consequence. So one of the things that we can't very well separate is where we got stuff, and indeed the difference between entertainment and news. News is supposed to be this delivery of information that in a democratic society is critical. And that's why in our society, freedom of the press is right there in the Bill of Rights. Not just because newspapers are nice things and therefore they are entitled to some nice treatment. It's because the whole deal, the whole democracy deal, depends on freedom of the press. Because if you don't have freedom of the press, then you don't have access to people's minds. If you don't equally have access to people's minds, if that isn't free, then what will happen is you will not have an intelligent government, that's for sure, but you may not have a democratic government at all, since the great powers, the autocrats, the dictators, the Nazis, the king, whatever it might be, the monarchy, can take over and run everything, and you won't know the difference. So it is very important, therefore, to get to make sure there is freedom of the press. But for entertainment is regarded in a more trivial way. Although the news and the newspapers are a kind of hallowed, quasi-holy organization and institution that we should take very seriously, the entertainment is seen as a kind of nonsensy froth. And although sometimes, and maybe we'll talk about that, these nonsensy froths are thought to have consequence in some direct way, they're ordinarily not taken in scholarship, at least, so seriously as the news and what goes on in the news. But maybe they should be. Because when we're watching, say, a television show, a TV drama, a series that involves, say, doctors in an operating room, there's one particular vision of doctors that's different than the life that doctors actually live. So the doctor shows that go back now 25, 35 years on television or longer tend to show doctors doing their job in a conscientious and careful way. There have been exceptions, but overwhelmingly, doctors are have high dignity, they are very conscientious, and they're on the job. The last time I was on an operating table, the very last thing I heard was the two doctors talking to each other. I've been on the operating table very rarely in my life, by the way. That was not a pitch for your sympathy. Very rarely. And I want to keep it that way. But the last time for minor surgery, but they did put me out. And I'm laying there, and as I'm going under, I hear them talking about how much problem they're having in booking patients so that they have billable hours in a continuous pattern. So if there's dead time in the doctor's office, then that's very bad for the bottom line of the doctor. And that's the last thing I hear as I then go right out and hope that they have at least an eye on the insides of my body and not just their mind on how to boost their billable hours and deal with the fact that there are empty spaces in the bookings that are being run by their receptionists and their business office. So we don't see that about doctors' lives. And there's a whole lot else we don't see about doctors. So some of them, well, some of you, anybody in this room have parents who are doctors? Raise your hand. I got one, I got 3 or 4 or 5. This side of the room, we got numbers of doctors in this room. How'd that happen? How did doctors' children get into NYU? It's just such a mystery. We should go through lawyers, and we'd probably get 90% of you by the time we ran through about 5 professions. Anyway, we get a certain pitch about doctors. But doctors, like everybody else, live complex lives. The series MASH made history because it really did reveal I don't know if all, but numbers of aspects of doctors' lives and how they actually think and work. But still, not the whole panoply for sure. Anyway, the way this has consequence is, for example, in debates about health care. Because if you think that the medical system is dominated by insurance companies, and when's the last time you saw a doctor show in which the insurance company plays a significant role? That's just not part of it. But that's an important part of doctors' lives. The scheduling difficulties that I spoke about there and managing a practice, selling your practice when you want to retire, fee for service and how that works, and whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. A lot of people think it's a bad idea. These things are not taken up in the medical entertainment world. And so it feeds then into how Americans respond to options for, say, a single-payer medical care system, a quote, government takeover. In other words, if the doctors were portrayed as mafiosos, the idea of a government takeover would seem like, well, that's a good idea. People, in fact, think that the government should take over the mafia. That would be a very good idea. But we shouldn't take over those doctors. That's a very bad idea. So what I'm getting at is that the distinction between news and entertainment is a false one. We interpret news and news stories. Like if you read that Senator so-and-so wants to have a single payer, and then someone else says, in this case, the Republican says, that's a government takeover, the way in which that will be received, who you will then vote for, whose policy will you support, is influenced by the picture in your head that you had about the medical world before you heard about these governmental options. Or even, actually, whether you'll even be interested in the governmental options. If you have a different sense of the medical world in its full organizational, I'm going to say, glory. Its multifaceted sides and the great significance that, for example, insurance companies play. The doctors, never mind the drug companies, the way they interact with physicians, the way in which the great medical centers, like NYU's medical center, is itself embroiled in interrelations with the drug industry, with the insurance industry, and what goes on takes on those qualities and characteristics, so that even the most dignified, prestigious, good places to go if you're going to be under the knife, even these places are deeply implicated in the medical system status quo and are not free to just willy-nilly support one kind of policy as opposed to another. Much, much is at stake. And let's do some other examples. What does it look like when the President of the United States is surrounded by his advisors? What does that look like? We have, just like many of us have been, who's been operated on in this room? Raise your hand. So we got a good number of people. Like me, I got that glimpse of this other medical world as I was going under. The most of you, when you go under, you don't even get that glimpse. Your last memory is a kindly nurse, perhaps, who pats your hand, and then boom, you're gone, and that's the end of that story. But you're left with the movie of what went on while you were under. And that movie does not consist of, say, the medical staff talking about their tennis game, their stock market trades, the booking issue that they're having. And the same is true of when a president of the United States is surrounded by his people. What does that look like? We don't know. We don't know really. We don't know what it looks like when a dictator is surrounded by his henchmen. We don't know. But we do have movies of what that looks like. And that plays out then in how we think about politics. That, by the way, one of the extraordinary things that we do know, or the information we have, comes from the Nixon presidency. Because Richard Nixon, you know, recorded every conversation that went on in the White House. And he was doing it, I think I read somewhere, maybe for historical reasons, or I don't know why he did it, but of course it was a big mistake, because then we heard what goes on in the White House, at least under President Nixon. And my best memory, the one I was so fond of the most, and of course that's what brought him down. That's what created the Watergate scandal and led to his forced resignation from the presidency of the US, the only president who's been forced out. And he was done in by this medium, by these tapes. But my favorite moment of all the tapes, I haven't listened to all of them, but I listened to some, was that his chief henchman, John Ehrlichman, he was plotting with Ehrlichman and Holderman, another key henchman, about what to do, about being charged with, or the thing that was, the scandal that was breaking in the news. It was still quite distant from Nixon, and the bullet hadn't come near him yet, anywhere near him yet, but he was concerned. And he's working this out, how to best respond to the various legal issues that were going on. And someone came to the door and said, Mr. President, I need to talk to you. The lira has collapsed. The lira was the currency of Italy. And Nixon said, what the fuck do I care about the lira? Now, if to hear a president of the United States talk that way is so contrary to Abraham Lincoln, you know, sitting in the chair, what the fuck do I care about the lira? You know, it just won't work. And of course, we put Lincoln in that seat to make you think that he never spoke like that. But I don't believe that. I think that the difference between Lincoln and Nixon was less great than the contrasts of the Emancipation Proclamation on the one hand and the what the fuck do I care about the Lyra speech on the other that would imply. I think they were probably closer together. And that the media world is what has helped us not see that. And so therefore, when we think about the powers that be, or at least for many people, maybe not the people in this room, you may be appropriately cynical and critical, but for many people, it's difficult, just difficult, in part through the entertainments that we have all absorbed without being very aware of it, to imagine an alternative reality in which people talk to each other the way Nixon talked to his colleagues about the Lyra. Well, so we have this combination then of entertainment and media. They're in interaction with each other. They're not separate things. And the question then is, how do they have their magical effect? How do they, in what way are these institutions, these organizations that mediate what is going on in what we can call reality and what is in our minds, such that we act one way as opposed to the other? So let's go through some of the possibilities. So one of the models is something that's been called the transfusion model. These are not big deal terms, by the way. They're just ways of summarizing it, just because I didn't want to use the word and mumble it and then you not see it. But it's the idea that our consciousness receives information from these media institutions, and that directly changes our behavior. So, for example, in the 1950s, this was when media were really coming under criticism for disturbing our consciousness, disturbing our country, creating delinquency of the sort you just saw. West Side Story really emerged out of this mode of consciousness and worries about the delinquents, of whom you saw all can sing and dance very, very well. How did that happen? And one of the theories was it's through the media. And rock and roll was a critical force. Bill Haley and the Comets, who were just great rock and rollers, among other things. And Congress held hearings on juvenile delinquency. And one of the culprits was another form of mass media, comic books. And the people who produce comic books, Marvel, are they still around? Is that company still around? Were brought in front of Congress and had to face the media, the senators. And it was like today when you see Mr. Toyota being hammered away. It was more raw than that, in which the senators and congressmen were pushing the idea that these people were the ones who were creating all of these horrible results in America, all of this. And Hollywood has been blamed for many other things as well. Now, of course, we need to worry about that a little bit. We're going to worry about it more than a little bit. One of the problems with this idea of a transfusion, and that explains it, it doesn't tell us where these ideas came from, and also it exaggerates the consequence. And so all through history, I think, as long as certainly there have been mass media, the media are given this autonomous power that it's almost like the mystical gods that infect people with ideas that set them off on bad courses of action, somehow gets into their soul, rots their brain, and makes them crazy. Now, one of the reasons we may doubt that is, again, going back to, say, the rates of violence around the world. Mass media work now virtually everywhere in the world. There's almost no societies where people don't get the picture of the world that they have from mass media. And indeed, from American mass media, which are so large-scale, they affect the whole world. Japan has one of the lowest murder rates in the world, one of the least violent societies in the world. And have you ever looked at Japanese comic books? Japanese comic books. Has anybody here ever looked at them? Yeah, just in the back. How would you characterize them? Who raised their hand? Yes. Extreme, and what? Extremely violent, extremely sexual, overly so. Okay, I don't know if I should have heard that. It could set me off on the wrong course. But it doesn't set the Japanese off on the wrong course, as measured by, say, rates of violence, murder, rape, assault and battery. Japanese society is a very peaceful place in those regards. So those instances aren't footnotes to history. Those are sociologically massive things to take on board. And it starts telling us that this idea that the media infect a consciousness and lead people onto wild behavior doesn't quite fit the lived experience of how people actually live. And what then would be the way to think then about how media work in people's lives? Well, it would be to say that it doesn't work through transfusion. And one of the reasons it doesn't is to go back to symbolic interaction and George Herbert Mead's theories, is that we are interpreting human beings, that human beings have a kind of active capacity to think and sort and figure out what if this makes sense, what if this doesn't make sense, and act accordingly. And so it doesn't just, people don't just rock it off because they've had the transfusion, because they've had the Kool-Aid, so to speak. And we also know that people pick and choose what they're going to watch and listen to and what they're going to read based on their prior leanings and how they have been oriented. So people who are of the Christian right listen to the Christian right, and they don't pick up the New York Times. It's just not available. So it doesn't matter that the New York Times is saying one thing and Rush Limbaugh says the other. They are not like a smoothie that consists of Rush Limbaugh and the New York Times all mashed together. Instead, people select out certain media, and they select out according to, in part, what they already believe, and they select out according to what those people who are the significant others in their lives also pick out, and the way they believe. And so systems of belief are collective, are social, like applause in Claptrap. It's a kind of commonly produced apparatus, this thing that is the knowledge in our heads, of which the mass media play a role. And if they don't run it on television, then we don't have that raw material to work with. But once it's there, out there, it gets conjoined with other possibilities of what we'll attend to and other things that are in our minds, and how we interact and intersect with other human beings who matter to us and what they are exposed to. And so, in other words, there's a kind of production apparatus that is outside the production apparatus of the media per se, in which human beings coming together construct what is in their minds, utilizing those mass media, but not in a way that implies a straight-on transfusion from, say, the media company into their own brain. So that is one model, the transfusion model, and it's one way to think about it. Now, the other common way that people sometimes think of how the media work is also, for the sociological eye, in the sociological imagination, also naive. And it sometimes is called the mirror idea. And it's the common sense notion that I think a lot of people start with when they think about the media. The media, especially the news media, mirror society. The word is no more fancy than that. That is, it's a way of recording what actually happened out there. And what happened out there comes to us through the media. That's what they make available, is the reality out there. And that reality is rather taken for granted as just there. The New York Times has as its slogan, who knows the slogan of the New York Times? Raise your hand if you do know. I promise not to call on you. What is it?
Isn't it like all news that's fit to print?
Yes, that was a good one. All the news that's fit to print. That implies a kind of straightforward relationship between what is in the New York Times and what happened yesterday. And that is, the New York Times has everything that happened yesterday, or at least everything that was fit to print. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, there's some things to look at here in a critical way. One is, did you notice ever that what is the thickest paper of the week? What's the largest paper of the week? The Sunday paper. But the day that went before Sunday is Saturday. And on Saturday, businesses are closed, the government is not working, Congress is not in session. So really, Sunday is what in the news business is called the slowest day of the week. So how come Sunday is the thickest paper? And in part, it's because it has a lot of advertising, but that's only part of the reason. It also has the most content. How can we explain that? What is going on? Well, here's how we explain it. In the newspaper business, the part of the paper that is got the print in it is called the news hole. I'm going to just put that up here. It's the news hole. And that was the term that was always used. And it's called the news hole because on the typical newspaper in the United States, the people who lay out the paper are the advertising department. They have sold the ads, and they then mock up what the paper will be based on placing the ads throughout the newspaper. And the places where they have not put the ads are called the news hole. People make their consumption decisions on Sunday. And that's why the family is together, they have some peace and quiet, they're not at work, and prepare their plans for buying on the Sunday. And that's why there are the most ads on Sunday. That means because there are the most ads, there's the largest news hole, and it has to be filled. And that's where the large amount of copy comes from on the Sunday. It's also because the automobile people advertise lots, and the tire people advertise lots, and so there need to be the sections that correspond to those particular businesses. And copy gets written, and there's a section on automobiles, and so forth and so on. So there is really not a clear distinction between the commercial role of the newspaper and its providing information. Now, we have some tools to understand that already because of the distinction that we talked about, or that Robert Merton made, between manifest functions and latent ones. And the newspaper, the New York Times, has as its manifest function all the news that's fit to print. And many newspapers have slogans that refer to, here's one, where opinions are free, truth shall prevail. That's from John Stuart Mill. Those are the manifest functions of the newspaper, to inform with all the news that's fit to print. But newspapers, like television and all the rest of them, are commercial media. And so more is going on than simply providing information and news. Much more is going on. And so therefore, if you are selling audiences to publics, that's another way to think about what the media are. They are selling audiences to advertisers. They are selling publics to advertisers. That's another way to think about what the media are actually doing. And if you factor that in, then you start explaining things. You start explaining why is there a food section in newspapers across the country on Thursday, not Sunday. And the reason is that people go to the supermarkets on Fridays in order to stock up and buy all the stuff for the weekend and the big family dinners. And that's why there's a food section on Friday, is to sell that audience to the appropriate advertisers who are going to be the food purveyors, the supermarkets, who are going to buy up that space. And you'll run stories accordingly in that news hole that surrounds those ads about how to surprise your family on Friday night dinner, oh my God, what to do about Lent, and how you need to get your Easter bunny ready for frying because Easter's coming. So you pitch it at that time. So a way to understand the structure of the newspaper, but also the structure of the minds that follow from the newspaper, is to keep in mind these latent functions. Well, let's go on to some other aspects of the media and other kinds of pieces of this latent structure that you also are reading about this semester. One of the features of the news media is they've got to generate a great deal of it under very rapid conditions. So everybody in this room, being here in the university, knows they have to write. We all are given writing assignments, me included, and we're on a certain schedule. So how many things do you have to write this semester? 2, 4, 6? Probably not too many more than 6, maybe 7, I don't know, something like that. But if you worked for a newspaper, it is a daily event. If you work for a television station and you're doing the news, you have to write story after story after story. So there's not a whole lot of time here. You've got to be quick about it. And how do you do that? How do you be quick about it? Well, one way you do it is by relying on others to do your work for you, or at least to help you do your work. And that means relying on organizations that are themselves considered reliable. And so now we have another aspect of the media. Not only are they things that advertise and act as a conveyor belt for advertisers, and we can understand a whole lot of what goes on from that, but they're also fairly large organizations, they differ of course in size, who employ people. And there are jobs that people are doing. And within sociology, there is a field of the sociology of occupations. And the idea is that if we learn what it is like to be a doctor, not the TV version, but the full-scale apparatus with the insurance companies and all the rest of it, and if we learn what it is to be a newspaper person, we will learn then about that industry, that activity. In the case of the media, we will learn about what is in our minds and how that came to be, how that came to be produced, and the substance of it. Well, you've got to work fast. And when you're working fast, you have to come up with a number of things. You have to come up with stories fast. You have to come up with stories that will be interesting to the public. And you have to come up with stories, better yet, if they will be acceptable to your bosses and to those who the bosses are themselves dependent upon, those higher up in power and authority, outside influences, including the advertisers, that otherwise could create a stink and create problems for you. Well, where do you go then to do your work? Well, one place you go is the police. The police they didn't used to call them, when I was growing up, when I was at your stage, we called them cops. And now they are police officers. And for years, I just couldn't get it through my mouth to say police officers. What is the officer part? Who's the officer? They're all, then who's the non-officer if they're all officers? Officers have to have someone who's not an officer. But they're all police officers. So that was a strange turn of events. But that implies that there is something untouchable about the police. The police have a kind of vaunted status. In our political world, who would go out and say, the police are corrupt, the police are violent? Oh, a few politicians, but it's not going to be a winning thing. The police are of high authority, high moral weight, and if you cross them, you're kind of in trouble. The other side of that is that if you take for granted what they say, no one's going to give you any beef. Every police department puts out something which in police parlance used to be called, I think still is, the blotter, B-L-O-T-T-E-R, which is just the record of crimes of the day. And this is the reports they fill out, which are publicly available. Again, this is a democracy. And so that means that all the interactions that the police have, they are supposed to write up. And to make an arrest, you certainly must do that. There has to be an arrest record, and there's an account given of what happened. Now, they use language not like Nixon, but more like Lincoln. They write in their reports, the alleged perpetrator was this and that and the other thing. They clean it up. So it's not the kind of language they use in the squad car. It's a different texture. That then is what the journalist finds. If the journalist goes to the police to find out what the crimes were of that day, there will always be crimes. They will always be written up. And often the public relations office of the police will have prepared it. And there will be hot coffee, and there will be phones to use. This is the old days now that everybody has their own cell phone. But convenience provided so that the magic can work and they can write a story very fast. So if you're a reporter with any brains, you will go to the police because you will be able to write it up conveniently and easily. In fact, some people call it easy news. Easy news. If you go, here's the contrast. The other way of interpreting who knows about crime are criminals. And so the alternative would be to go and interview criminals to find out how crime is working. But that isn't the way that's being done. Do you have a hand up, or you're doing a head scratch? Okay. I hope you got it. So you can go to the criminals. But if you went to the criminals and they started telling you things, you couldn't write it up and just send it in. You'd have to fact check it 42 times. You'd have to have confirming evidence. It would have to become a big deal. And that means that although there are such stories once in a while, for example, that also say there is police corruption, and the criminals tell us that, it's a hard road to hoe. And it's going to be much more difficult than if you just report what was there through the police. And as Mark Fisherman has written, these dependencies become built into the structure of what the police do. So the police know that if they make a move of a certain sort, it's going to be in the media. They interpret it themselves and write it up in a way that makes it appropriate for the media. The media know that the police are doing this, and it structures and gives rise to what is called in the media business the beat structure. So if you think about it this way, if tomorrow you become head of a television network, of network news at NBC or CBS, you've got to figure out how to cover the United States or how to cover New York. Well, it's just this buzzing confusion of infinite proportions. The New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, is a massive simplification. That can't be right. And you've got to therefore carve it up. And the way you carve it up is through creating the beat structure. And that means that you might have the police, you might have the courts, you might have NYU and universities, you may have City Hall. Each of these organizations, and NYU has a very active public information office here that is constantly cooking things up for the media, a press relations department, and so does General Motors and the automobile industry. They're all generating little droppings. That's what's happening in these organizations. And they are all legitimate organizations. So the media then is going around from one to the other, to the other, to the other, picking up things they know will be there and that they will be legit in one way or another. So you can get a whole lot of stuff done in a short amount of time by going around and picking up the droppings from the pans that these organizations deposit for your mind. So what this means is, now let's just follow it one step forward, one step onward. What is in our minds are organizationally created. Remember we talked about Max Weber and the importance that Weber says organizations play in our world. And Weber puts up the characteristics of a bureaucracy, of a chain of command, offices, and all of that. Well, in a way, that's what this looks like. There are offices. But what Weber doesn't do, because he's busy, he's got other things to do, what he doesn't do is open up how these things work in these other ways, these latent ways. Weber was big on manifest more than latent, how they actually operate. And in this case, when we're talking about the media, we're talking about the making of minds, the filling in of consciousness, of determining what we are and how we think. You're reading about the Halloween candies and the idea of an urban legend. How many of you went trick-or-treating as children? Raise your hand. Okay, I've got pretty much everybody. Who didn't go trick-or-treating? You didn't. Okay, why didn't you? India. India, they don't do trick-or-treating. That's an important thing to know. Why didn't you go trick-or-treating? You don't celebrate Halloween. Fair enough. Okay, for different reasons in the American context, you're deviant. We have two deviant people with good reasons for their deviance. But for all the rest of us, Halloween, candy, and trick-or-treating is a very big deal, and we all participate in that. How many of you were told that were warned about the candy you might collect? Raise your hand. Wow, isn't that just amazing? Okay, now you know from having read the piece that that was just a lot of crap. That the only instances we know, very, very few, when anyone was done in by Halloween candy was when it was an inside job and mother's boyfriend wanted to get rid of the child. Then you could put the razor blade in the apple, which is not a good way of doing it anyway. It's a bad way of doing it. So the word urban legend, that term, comes from this study, by the way. This is the sociological study done like 25 or 30 years ago, I don't remember which, that generated the term urban legend and puts us on guard that some things which people believe are real in their consequences, even when wrong. When I lived in California and the trick-or-treat massive thing happened, the hospital, the major hospital, there were only two, put out the announcement that if you wanted, you could bring your candies to the hospital and they would put them through the MRI to check them out. So now you have this vast enterprise of medical installations to deal with something which we know is a fiction, and we should just enjoy our Halloween candy. Don't think you don't get something useful out of this class, and that's what is the useful piece, is to enjoy your Halloween candy and make the most of it. So, what have we got here? I'll give you another sociological saying. Okay, what I've poked holes in is I've tried to make more problematic what is in the media, and I've tried to make it problematic not by saying that it is a capitalist plot, which it kind of is. That doesn't make it's not total nonsense, or that it has transfusions that it generates to twist our minds that doesn't seem to hold water either. But rather what I've tried to do is get across the idea that to think that it is simply a good record, as the New York Times wants us to think, of what went on the day before is an astonishing simplification that won't work. And that instead there are all of these other processes, of which I've only given you a few examples, to say that, and it's our old slogan again and again, that there is a social context that is at work, that is shaping, in this case, what is available for us to start playing with in our minds, and then to turn into visions of what the world is, which then becomes the stuff which we then use. And I wanted to give you this other slogan that sociologists often use. What I've done is, in a way, try to poke holes in the idea that the media are just good records of what's going on, or that they're even records at all of what's going on. That the relationship between what's gone on and what then gets to be in our brain about what's gone on is a very complex process. And indeed, some people would say there is no what's gone on, that it's a false distinction, that what we make of the world and what that world is are so incriminated with one another, so in such intimate interaction, that to even speak of the reality out there versus the pictures or portrayals of that reality is itself a false distinction. That we're just so swimming in our own world that we have created as human beings through these organizations, among other forces, that it's hard to, it's impossible to separate them out. And so finally, ladies and gentlemen, the slogan that I've been waiting to give you, there are good reasons. A sociologist who's still alive once said, not me, by the way, good reasons for bad records. So one thing you can do is you can look at the New York Times or USA Today or the Post, and you could say, wait a minute, this isn't what really happened. I was at that rally. This isn't really what happened. Doctors are all involved in the insurance industry and taken conferences and vacations from the drug companies. That's what's going on here. This is not a good record. This is a bad record of what's happened. But the sociological mission, following, I think, from Mills as well, is not just to say this is a bad record, but to assume that there are good reasons for those bad records. Good reasons, in the sense that there are organizational and sociological forces that give that record one particular form as opposed to another particular form. And if we can find the good reasons, then we've hit home. And that's what I've been trying to do today. That's what Fisherman is trying to do. It's not quite what the Best and Horiyuchi are doing, because on the Halloween candies, they just want to show you their bad records. That's primarily what they're doing. But the fact that people are interested in poisonings like Snow White, I mean, that's the coolest thing there is. Adam and Eve, wow, what a story. When you can read, if in the news business they say, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the way they structure the newscast. If it bleeds, it leads. Not always, not every paper. But bleeding is good, okay? And bleeding is good because you can get it from the police department really fast. You can take a picture. That's better. Folks, it has a good dramatic narrative to it. That's cool. It won't offend Macy's because Macy's is going to sell shoes anyway. So run it. There are good reasons for bad records. And finding out the good reasons is what it's all about here in sociology. Okay? Okay, now you have to leave because another class is coming in. And if we don't play our role and get out, then the other class can't come in. And the whole thing will come to a collapse.